Hey everyone, Jesse here, and this is another of our kind of a new thing. This is what the cutting room floor has on it from a sermon. It didn't have enough time to make it into the message, and for whatever reason, had to be pulled out so that the message met the need of the moment. But there is so much history and so much richness that I just don't want to leave it there. So this video, if you're kind of finding this for the first time or out of order of a series, just to kind of put this in context of time, today for me is Tuesday afternoon, and this past Sunday we preached a sermon through John chapter 10, actually the second half of John chapter 10, and really just kind of hit the top peaks of a lot of history that helps make that conflict make sense. And even in the message, I made comment like it's just too much to cover right now, and I hope to come back to it. So this is that. This is us coming back to it. I don't know how long to expect this video to go, so it might be a little on the long side, but let me tell you what to expect from this. You should be able to, as a result of this history and what we're looking at, not only understand the end of John chapter 10, but really understand all of the drama about why Jesus seemed to pose a threat to everyone. The Jewish leaders saw Jesus as a threat. The Roman leaders saw Jesus as a threat. And you and I were so far removed from all of that we may be blind to it. It may be something we're just not aware of. And so I want to try to unpack that some here as well. A second goal that I have for getting into this is to really just get a clear look at what the message of Jesus is in contrast to the message of every other political entity of that time and our time right now, that his message is still being proclaimed today as the alternative message to every kingdom and every nation that has ever walked the earth, including the ones that you and I live in now, including the ones that are making the news today. And so my hope is to do this justice. I'm sure that I may get a date or a year wrong here or there. So put it in the comments, correct me, or add to it if I missed a really big point. I would love to hear from you. So let's get into it, and we'll see how far this takes. And it's just me running this thing, so I don't know. I may trip over something, but let's get into the text. Bible, John chapter 10, verse 22, which is where we began our message Sunday, says, "At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews, or the Jewish leaders, gathered around him and said to him, 'How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly.'" And so there's obviously some drama there. We talked about it a little bit Sunday. I want to kind of tease out, like, where's all of this energy coming from, and try to put it in a way that makes sense. So I want to pull up a timeline right quick, just to back this up. And so if we are looking at John chapter 10, we're probably in the year AD 30, give or take a year. There's some room to kind of try to figure that out. But AD 30, AD 31, AD 32, somewhere in those 2 or 3 year windows. And so let's back up a few hundred years and see what is going on. The Old Testament timeline ends with the Israel, the Jewish people, coming back from exile. And so in 586 BC, the first temple that was built by King Solomon has been destroyed by the Babylonians as the Jewish people are taking into captivity. They spend some time in exile, get passed around from a couple of nations in there, and then they're allowed to come back in waves. And so the Old Testament ends with what things look like as they are coming back. Somewhere around 350 BC, the temple is rebuilt. It was destroyed completely, and then it's been rebuilt. And Scripture says that the people, when they looked at it, when they went to dedicate it, it was not anything close to what was before, not anything close to what they believed the temple should look like. It was not as extravagant. And so they had this temple, and they had access to worship God, and things continued. It ends up getting a makeover I'll get to in a moment. But I want to fast forward a little bit. After 350 BC, just time kind of ticks on. The people are worshiping. There are other nations around at the time, but in 167 BC, there is this moment, this big event that history calls the Maccabean Revolt with Judas Maccabeus. We talked about him a little bit Sunday, so I'll briefly highlight him here just to bring it into the context of this video. Here's a video, or excuse me, I don't have a video of Judas Maccabeus. Here's a picture of him, actually just a coin of him. And Judas Maccabeus was a priest in that temple, that second temple that was built. And he is in charge of or responsible for trying to help people worship God as any priest should be. And he takes his job seriously. Maccabeus means like hammer or the hammer. And when we get to the fighting part of Judas's story, apparently he used the hammer. Maybe that's how he got the name. Maybe it was a nickname assigned to him as a result of that. I've also read something as I was preparing for this video that the letters Maccabeus in I guess it would have been Hebrew. Those letters create an acronym that they say means "Who among the gods is like you, O Adonai," which is O Lord. It's like a decree. And the source that I read that from said that he would shout that as he was going into battle, as he was having the fights that we call the Maccabean Revolt. Who among the gods is like you, O Adonai? That is an ironic thing to yell, considering the conversation Jesus has in the temple in John chapter 10. But don't let me get ahead of myself. Why was Judas Maccabeus fighting? What was going on? What turns a priest into a warrior, into a soldier, and brings this kind of energy? If you back up just a few hundred years before this, a man by the name of Alexander the Great just basically conquers the whole world. And as he conquers the world, he brings his culture in. We call this the Greek culture. And as the Greek culture blended with the culture of the area, the word that historians use for that now is Hellenization. And what was happening is that this Hellenization or this Greekification or whatever you want to call it slowly crept into all the corners of society, everywhere that he had conquered, including Israel, including Jerusalem. And so as the people began to blend with this Greek culture, some people really embraced it and some people really resisted it. Those who embraced it began to forget how to speak Hebrew and started speaking Greek instead. Those who resisted it held on to their language and held on to their culture. And as time went on, as a few hundred years, it would have been 4th century for Alexander the Great, so we're 200 years later. In those 200 years, it became more and more of a divisive thing. You were either a sellout or you're holding on to the pure version of our culture. And it created this polarizing effect. Instead of people just being really close to each other but having a minor disagreement, it was all left versus all right, all conservative versus all liberal. I'm not going to bring any modern day commentary into it, but I think we could probably look around and see some context in which it used to be different, it used to be closer, and now everybody is just so against each other. And so as this polarization took off, the other leaders in the world at the time saw the infighting, the arguing, the debating, and a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Seleucid king, which is the Seleucids were part of the Greek city-state tribal system. Each area had a different king, and this is before the Roman Empire exists. And this Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes, he was terrified that this would be a Jewish revolt, that they will cause some kind of big problem, and we don't really want any kind of big problem like this, and so let's stop it. And so, what's a good way to stop this? There are probably some better ways to find peace, but Antiochus Epiphanes decided, you know what I'm going to do? He conquers Jerusalem. He just marches in there with his army. He takes the city of Jerusalem first, continues fighting, and takes the temple that Judas Maccabeus was a priest in, the temple that they had already lost once, and had rebuilt within memory of some of the oral history at the time. As he conquered the temple and as he placed and began to remove Judaism from the temple. He made it against the law to practice Judaism. Nobody's allowed in the temple but us. He began to desecrate the temple. He brought false gods, false idols into the temple and set them up and said that this temple is now to these gods. He outlawed all Jewish practices. He outlawed circumcision of children, which if you're Jewish or practicing Jew and it's serious, then on that 8th day you want to see your son circumcised. It was against the law all of a sudden. Prayer was against the law. Just everything you could think of. You're not allowed to think about Judaism. And then to take it one step further, to completely disgust all Jewish temperaments about the temple, he dedicates the temple that was built for Yahweh to the Greek god Zeus. And he does that by having a sacrifice that is acceptable apparently to Zeus. He gets a pig and he takes it into the altar of God, and he slaughters the pig as a sacrifice unto Zeus. And then he smears the blood on all the things that are the temple, on the altar, on the objects inside the temple, on the walls of the temple, on the ground, on everything. This is known as, and you can Google this, it's known as the abomination of desolation, which even if you don't know what that is, historically, that phrase, abomination of desolation, is terrifying. It sounds terrible. It sounds ominous. And so, as you might imagine, few people weren't happy about this. One of those people is our boy, Judas Maccabeus. He decides to revolt. He gets a few followers and they begin kind of guerrilla warfare style fighting. We have to fight these people back. And so they start in kind of the countryside and things. And each battle they win, a few more people join them, then a few more people. And so they prepare to conquer the temple. And so I want to bring up the temple. This is a model of the temple that we looked at Sunday. It is actually a little bit more advanced than what Judas Maccabeus would have been protecting, but it gives you the idea of the scale and the size. This would be the homes in the back that people lived in. This is the temple. This is the temple mount here, and then the wall all the way around the temple. I'll show you another view to give you an idea of the height. There it is. And so this is, again, it's a model. So that's a normal size human, and this is a smaller version of the temple. But this is how high the wall was. And Judas Maccabeus fights to capture the temple. We talked about this. There was a battle, and then he needs to hold the temple. And, legend has it, history books or ever how you want to say that, that there was kind of a miraculous moment that they didn't have enough oil to light the lamps, and it lasted 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, until 8 days, until backup came. And so this feast that Jesus is at in John chapter 10, the Feast of Dedication, the Hebrew word for dedication is Hanukkah. And the reason that you know some Jewish friends, or maybe you know some Jewish people, that they celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days, it's in remembrance of Judas Maccabeus holding the temple and keeping the Seleucids at bay. And so this makes Judas, our guy from here, let's bring him up. This makes him a hero. He's straight soldier, very almost Davidic in that moment, half king, half leading the people to religious purity. And so he's a hero. He may even be considered a Christ-like figure. Maybe some people were thinking maybe he's the Messiah. Maybe he's the one who's supposed to come. So what happens next? Well, they keep fighting, and they decide we're going to push this as far back as we can. Judas Maccabeus continues going to battle. He eventually dies in the year 160 BC, so about 7 years after that revolt that we just looked at, that fighting for independence. And so turns out he's not the Christ. He died in battle. And so the hunt for the Christ continues, but also the hunt for a solution to not losing the temple continues. There's still this threat out there. The Jewish people who are trying to stay close to God and close to his temple and access and worship him, there's still a risk that they can lose it if somebody else comes into power. And so the family of Judas Maccabeus, they begin leading the people again through priestly activities, and they have just this massive respect from the people. They don't need a title or anything at first, and the family creates this dynasty that leads Israel that history calls the Hasmonean dynasty. And so the Hasmoneans, they lead for a while. They develop a peace treaty between them and what was then the infant Roman Republic, very early in what would later become the Roman Empire. But they developed peace with them to kind of have a time of ease. People respected them. And then their leadership was passed down from generation to generation. And at first they didn't need titles. They didn't need, any kind of, fanfare, but, as tends to be the case in most political circles, one generation comes up and then the next generation doesn't really treat it the same way. And eventually someone assigns themselves the title of high priest. So I'm not just a priest, I'm the high priest. And a few generations later, one of them assigns themselves as I'm high priest and king. I'm now king of Israel. I'm now king of the Jews. And so you start to see in several generations there a lot of political maneuverings, and you even see some assassinations within the family to try to get the power sorted out. And so that you can kind of see some things falling apart there. What's going on with the Romans in this time? Well, Rome also is beginning some of its maneuverings, its political maneuverings. And hang with me. I told you this is a lot of history, but it's all going to come together. And so we get to Pompey, and he doesn't actually conquer Jerusalem. He occupies Jerusalem. But the threat of conquering is there, and the threat that he would take over the temple is there. And so he makes it a point to hand select who would run Jerusalem. It's a way to force peace through maneuverings. And so the Hasmonean family at the time there were two brothers that were fighting it out for who would be the next leader of the Hasmonean dynasty, the leader of Jerusalem, leader of the temple. And Pompey, he goes in and he looks at one and he says, oh, that guy is a real strong military leader, has a lot of respect of the people. I'm going to go with the other guy. And he hand selects the other guy and says he's in charge. And through the threat of his own force, Pompey's force, he maintains that power. And so now you start to see how this Greek and Roman influence is starting to manipulate the politics that are in Jerusalem at the time. Fast forward a little bit, and we get to a guy that you may recognize in 44 BC, a guy by the name of Julius Caesar. He's crowned Caesar, basically dictator of this thing that is about to become the Roman Empire, but not quite yet the empire. There's a Senate that is in place and it's starting to gain in power. Julius Caesar, he doesn't stay in power very long. He lasts for 4 years. He's assassinated. You probably know that, right? E2 Brutus or whatever, Brutus and somebody else whose name Caiaphas, it doesn't matter, have assassinated him, and civil war breaks out in Rome. And so it's important as we look at this, like there's a sort of civil war-ish thing happening in the Jewish side of this, and there's a civil war definitely happening on the Greek-Roman side of this. And so seeing the chaos in this Hasmonean family, another family begins to make moves in Israel. And this is the family that will later have Herod the Great, the man that we know as Herod the Great. Herod the Great's rule began in 37 BC, right here. Just before that, while all of this civil war is happening, Herod, there's no emperor, there's no dictator left, they're still fighting it out, they're having the civil war. Herod travels to the city of Rome, goes into the Senate and says, hey, you notice my family really knows how to play nice with the Romans, and you see all that fighting over there, and I know you guys got a lot going on. How about you let me be the king? And so the Senate looks at it, they vote, and they vote from the city of Rome to make Herod the current king of Jerusalem and sends him back to go and fix this. And he kind of establishes his power in 37 BC. That vote happened, I think, in 40, but he gets back there, and during this time, he needs to earn the respect of the people. So he starts building projects. And one of the big building projects he does is this temple. This is now the second temple, but it's with the Herod the Great remodel. And it's happening in the 30s BC. It's very close to the time that we're looking at now. And his remodel is like so celebrated. People looked at it and they're like, that last temple, like it wasn't great, but this is awesome. We get to worship God. Don't know about this like hand selected the king thing, but he's okay. Herod the Great, he has some good stuff going on. He builds another capital city on the coast, and he leaves Jerusalem to rule Israel from this coastline, and Rome will later use the capital that he builds. And so Jerusalem sort of gets left alone to fend for itself with this new temple that he built. Herod the Great is a little bit of a paranoid guy, and he really likes to maneuver. He really likes to angle. Like he's going to vote on his horse. Who's going to be the next person? And there's this moment when they are about to find out who the next emperor is, who the next Caesar is going to be of Rome. And between this man named Octavius and this man named Mark Antony, you may have heard those names. Mark Antony, of course, has this relationship with Cleopatra, and Egypt is involved with that. But between Mark Antony and Octavius, Herod the Great needs to choose which horse to vote on, because his whole power is based on them giving it to him. So one of these two guys is about to be emperor, and so he chooses Mark Antony first. And after some time, he realizes Mark Antony is about to lose, and so he switches sides and he goes with Octavius. And sure enough, he was right. In 27 BC, this man named Octavius becomes emperor, changes his name. He's known as Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar is a very powerful and really the first emperor of what is now very much so the Roman Empire. And he brings order under his thumb. He brings peace to the land. It's called the Pax Romana. It's a statement of peace, that I'm bringing my peace all over this land. Realize this for historical sake. It's 27 BC. This is during the lifetime of Mary and Joseph, Jesus's earthly parents, right? This is before the birth of Jesus, but it would have been during their lifetime. This is in the memory of all of the elders in the temple during the time of Jesus. This moment isn't some faraway history to them like it is to us. It is, we experience this, and we see how chaotic it is. Caesar Augustus, he sends out what's called the Gospel of Augustus, this message that he brings peace, and he calls himself the Son of God. I did a message on that about a year ago. I might link to it in the comments under here if I can find it, but just maybe Google if you want the Gospel of Caesar Augustus, and you read that and you tell me that that was not on the minds of people when they read the Gospel of Jesus, according to Luke. And so Caesar Augustus is the emperor during the time of Jesus's birth, and he hands off his role to Tiberius, who is a very paranoid, very secluded kind of guy. Very hard to gauge what he's going on. So enough history. Let's paint all this back together. Why is the tension so thick during all of the Gospels between Jesus, the Jews, and the Romans? Why is it so thick? Well, the Jewish leaders know that they barely have access to the temple. They only have access because the people in power are giving them permission to have access. So they don't want to do really anything to upset that, out of fear that their access to worship God will be destroyed. They need to be able to get to God, and that's the only way that they know to. This guy, Herod the Great, he's the semi-Jewish leader that his only true authority comes because he was hand-selected by Rome. And unfortunately for him, the guy who's currently in charge, he kind of betted on the other one. And so everything about him is delicate as well. Like if Caesar Augustus decides, hey, I'm done with you, you should have picked me at the beginning, it's over for him. The Rome, now that Tiberius is in charge, is entering this new chaotic time where, the last guy, like, he had a good head on his shoulders, but this guy, he's a little dangerous. He hides and he gets really freaked out. What's going on? And in the middle of all of that tension, Jesus walks into the temple on the day that they celebrate the Maccabean revolt, on the feast, the high moment of that thing. And they have to be asking the question, whose side is Jesus on? Is he on the Hasmonean side? Is he going to establish the Maccabean family? Is he on Herod's side? Is he on the Herodian side? He's going to establish this king, or maybe he's going to be on the Roman side, or maybe he's going to create a new side. They have to be kind of losing their minds. And so I want to skip down to verse 30 of that. There's this debate, and they say to Jesus, "Tell us who you are." And Jesus says, "You don't need more information. It's a lack of belief. You can listen to the sermon for that. We explored it there." But in verse 30, Jesus makes this huge declaration. He says, "I and the Father are one." Jesus says, "Me and the creator of the universe, me and the one who all of these people are trying to know and trying to worship, me and the person that you're trying to get to through this temple." Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." He doesn't choose the Hasmoneans. He doesn't choose the Herodians. He doesn't choose the Romans. He doesn't choose any of the earthly kingdoms or political parties. He has his own authority. He has his own agenda, and it's different than all the other ones that are in conflict. Jesus doesn't get his authority from some client-king relationship with another government. He claims to be God in the flesh, the rightful ruler of all of this. And as we looked at Sunday, the Jewish leaders understood what he said, and they needed to stop it. They were not going to wait for a legal proceeding. They picked up stones to kill him, because if this message leaks out, the next Maccabean revolt might kick off. We might lose the temple, I'm sure they thought. We might lose everything. This man is too dangerous to even listen to. And so they go to kill him. But Jesus responds to them. And so I want to skip down to verse 34. It says in verse 34, Jesus quotes this really weird passage in the book of Psalms. He says in verse 34, Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your law, I said that you are gods?" Now, it's a weird quote. It's a very small quote of a larger section of Psalm 82. But Jesus and all of these other people, take the Bible seriously. And so Jesus is letting scriptures defend him. If the people continue to pursue him, then they have to say that we don't care about scriptures. Well, they would never say that. But if they say that we care about scriptures, then they have to stop trying to silence Jesus and give him a chance to explain himself. And they don't want to do that. They're stuck. They're like in a catch-22. These people, pretty much all of the people in the room at the time, would have had all of Psalm 82 memorized. And so just like you and I, if I quote one song, if I say "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," you immediately know you're supposed to wonder where you are. You know the next line, because I can just quote the one bit and it's in our culture. This is a song to them, and he quotes one line of the song. It's scriptural, but they would have sang it to music, and surely they thought and remembered the entire psalm all at once. And I don't think that that's an accident. The content of Psalm 82 directly speaks to all of the chaos that these people have been feeling for the last several hundred years, and directly speaks to this conflict in this day, in this moment where Jesus is being threatened. What does Psalm 82 say? I want to read it. Psalm 82, verse 1 says, "God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds a judgment." It opens up, it's almost like a playwright telling you what the scene is. And it's imagining this moment where the creator of the universe, God Almighty, is entering into a council chamber with people or beings, or whatever, how you want to say this, that he has delegated responsibilities to. And so God holds judgment. Verse 2 says, "How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked?" And it says Selah. It's in the Psalms, the word Selah, they believe, is a moment to pause and reflect. If we were playing this in modern music, this would be like the part where a big bridge happens and you're just like, oh, wow. You just listen to the weight of that. The creator of the universe shows up and looks at the people that he delegated responsibility into and say, "How long will you judge unjustly? How long will you show partiality to the wicked? You're not doing what I told you to do." Verse 3, "Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked." He goes on to say, the psalmist says, they, being the people around them, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness, and all the foundations of the earth are shaken. It's almost like God is looking at the people he delegated to and says, it was your job to give them the knowledge. And they're darkened in their knowledge. They don't know what to do. All of these people, they want to get to God, and the people that were meant to teach them how to do it are standing in the way of that happening. Jesus is quoting that in the temple. My goodness. Verse 6, I said, this is the phrase that Jesus quoted, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Verse 7, nevertheless, like men, you shall die, and all fall like any prince. If I say, twinkle, twinkle, little star, you immediately know I wonder where you are. Jesus quotes the line, I said you are gods. And the next line says, nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. It is a heated moment when Jesus says that. And the psalm ends on verse 8. It says, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. The Gospel of John, as a piece of literature, is incredibly beautiful. We have this moment right here in John chapter 10 that mirrors what was happening at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John chapter 2. In both John 2 and John 10, Jesus shows up to the temple, and his complaint is, it was your responsibility to show them how to get to God, and you were standing in the way. In John chapter 2, Jesus flips the tables. That's a famous piece. In John chapter 10, he's back in the temple and he's saying basically the same thing. And this conflict is at a head. And surely some of these people remember, didn't Jesus flip the tables last time he said that? Jesus quotes some Old Testament passage about the purpose for priests in both sections. In both John 2 and John 10, he looks in the Old Testament and says, it was your responsibility to lead the people, and you're not. You've turned this project, this temple, into something it was never meant to be. It was meant to be a beacon, a light that showed people how to get right with God, and you're not doing that. In both sections, Jesus laments that the people who are trying to get close to God, they're being prevented. In both sections, there's this moment that comes out in chapter 2. The leaders ask Jesus for a sign of his authority to flip the tables. And he says, and I quote, destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And now in John chapter 10, the threat is we might lose the temple. It might get destroyed. And Jesus just sits there in that tension. These bookends on John are powerful. Because this is a YouTube video, I'll go ahead and go a little bit further and say, as I was studying for this, there's so many parallels to the beginning of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of John. And this spot, John chapter 10, is the end of Jesus' public ministry. In both sections, they start at the Jordan River, at the place where John was baptizing them. In both sections, crowds went to that place who wanted to know more about Jesus. The access to Jesus was not being blocked by the religious leaders. In both sections, people who met Jesus in that place chose to believe him and have life. In John chapter 2, Jesus goes to a wedding. In John chapter 11, Jesus goes to a funeral. That's wild. In both of these sections, there are quotes in the Old Testament. There's so many beautiful things that are happening with the Gospel of John. And so this psalm being quoted is almost like Jesus saying, Psalm 82, it's almost like Jesus saying, it was delegated to you. And when he says, arise, or when the psalmist says, arise, O God, judge the earth. Of course, Jesus didn't quote that, but surely they heard it. Arise, O God, arise, O God, and judge the earth. It's almost like Jesus is saying, here I am. I and the Father are one. I delegated this to you and you're not doing it. So I'm going to make sure that people have access to God, even though the temple is not operating the way it's supposed to. Jesus says the phrase, I and the Father are one, in this location, on this day, with this passage hanging in the air. And he's basically declaring that the psalm is being answered, and he holds himself out as the opposite of all the things that were being criticized in Psalm 82. Jesus does judge justly. Jesus doesn't show partiality to the wicked. Jesus does give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Jesus does maintain the rights of the afflicted and destitute. Jesus does rescue the weak and the needy. And Jesus gives light in the darkness when all that they have was confusion. Jesus brings clarity. Jesus is holding himself out as not only the fulfillment, but actually a much better version of who was delegated. It's like God in heaven. If I want it done right, I'm going to have to do it myself. And he puts on flesh. We know him as Jesus, and he does it. He brings this message forward. So here's the question. In this moment in John 10, which of these two sides was right? The Jewish leaders afraid that they're about to lose the temple, or Jesus, who holds himself out as the Word made flesh, God made flesh? Let's look at a few more pieces of history. After Tiberius, the depressed and paranoid emperor, we get a few not so great people that come after him. Caligula. I recommend you Google him with a little, maybe like a parent filter on your computer. The Romans disliked this guy so much they assassinated him. A guy named Claudius pops up. I'll be honest with you. Before I was working on this, I don't think I even realized there was a man named Claudius that was an emperor in that time. I don't know anything about him. Following Claudius is another famous jerk of the Bible, Nero. Emperor. He ends up being condemned to execution for how odd he is and how weird he acted. He did bizarre things. So much of the rest of the New Testament, all the persecution that was being handed down to Christians during the time of Paul and later, that was done under the watch of Nero in many ways. And he ends up, even though he was condemned to execution, he leaves Rome and commits suicide later. And then we get to a guy named Vespasian. After Nero, Vespasian, he says, I'm really, we've got to do something in Jerusalem, in Israel. And so he has a general named Titus, and he sends Titus to silence the Jews, to silence what's going on. And Titus conquers Jerusalem, conquers the temple, and destroys it brick by brick in 70 AD. This is documented not in the Bible. This is documented in our history books. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And Jesus predicted that the temple would be destroyed. In fact, while standing in the temple, Luke records this. Luke chapter 21, verse 5 says, "And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones." Look at it. Look at how it's adorned. Jesus is looking at this temple and he says, as it's adorned with all these noble stones that Herod the Great put there, they loved it. He said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Jesus predicted around 30 AD that not one stone would be left. All the things that they were fighting to keep, all the things that they were making compromises within themselves to keep, Jesus said, it's going away. It's not worth fighting for if you're not going to be able to lose it. The thing you're fighting for is lost anyway. And that prediction came true in 70 AD. Again, this is a model of the temple. This is not the actual Temple Mount, but I want to highlight this little archway right here on the corner. You can still go there today, and I had the opportunity in 2009 to go there. And so if you'll, if you're still watching, let's look at something real quick. This is not a model. This is the actual Temple Mount. This is that corner. Let me go back one. This corner and that archway is this corner, and that's the beginning of the archway. You can go and you can stand there, and you can see down that wall. You get a kind of a sense of how tall that wall is, in fact. Here's a picture of me, of much younger me in 2009, sitting under that arch. So above my head up here is that arch. I do, in fact, have a trophy husband shirt on because that was the year after I was married. I'd just been married about 3 months at that moment, 4 months. And so I'm posing or taking a picture under that Temple Mount. I want to highlight, though, all of this rubble back here. I want to take another look at that. There's that rubble back there, and you have these crater marks, and it's roped off right here. To this day, Israel, by law, I suppose, has protected some of the destruction as a marker for what has happened. This rubble and these craters occurred because Vespasian in 70 AD sent General Titus into Jerusalem to conquer it, and he destroyed it, and he pushed the pillars over the side and let them crash into the ground. As these giant marble blocks were hitting the ground, they left these craters that you can still go and see today. Vespasian celebrated this destruction. It was such a great accomplishment. Yay, Titus. That Titus gets this arch made in remembrance of that. This is called the Arch of Titus. It is currently in Rome. My understanding is that It may be within walking distance of the Colosseum. I could be wrong on that. Correct me in the comments. But this is the Arch of Titus, celebrating that he was able to conquer Jerusalem and conquer the temple and fix whatever they consider the problem to be. If you zoom in on the arch, you find these little reliefs, I think that they're called. This is on that arch, and it is this was made just a few years after the conquering of the temple, celebrating that not only did they win, but they looted the temple. This is the menorah that came out of the temple. Here's some of the other items that they took out of the temple as they destroyed the thing that everybody was trying to fight to keep. If you have any Jewish friends, if you know any Jewish loved ones, their hearts still long for the temple to be restored. They still want to see worship to Yahweh occur in that location. And Jesus said to them, the temple's not going to last, and yet they compromised so much in the time of Jesus trying to hang on to that thing that was slipping from their grip. I want to look at one more picture I took during my trip in 2009. This is the Western Wall. This is the ground level. This is that wall. The Temple Mount would have been up there. This is called the Western Wall. Sometimes it's called the Wailing Wall. And here's a young man, a Hasidic Jew, praying at the Western Wall of the Temple Mount. He has his scriptures in front of him, and he's praying. I don't pretend to know what he was reading at the time. You may be able to see, or you may know, all this little white in the cracks right there are people will write their prayers down. They'll roll them up and they'll stuff them in the mortar joints of that. Many of the prayers, some of them will be things that you and I pray for, but many of these prayers are that the Lord God would restore the temple, would bring back the temple, will bring back the ability to worship him in the way that is described in scriptures and described in their law, and they just don't have access to it. They can't. It's not there. Their hearts are grieving. When we were there, there was a conversation right same day that I took this picture. There was a man walking by. We had this conversation, a group of us, and we were talking to him. And someone asked, he said, what is? Yeah, everybody here is here praying. What are they praying for? And this man, he was very happy to help a tourist understand. He said they're praying that Messiah would come, that the Lord would send Messiah, and that he will restore worship, or restore the temple, restore Israel to the way it should be, something to that effect. And someone in our group said something to the effect of, "Oh, I thought Messiah had come. I thought Jesus was Messiah." And this man, he's just a data point of one. He doesn't represent an entire group of people, as far as I know. But this man, his response was slow, and he hung his head. And in a quiet and a more serious voice, he said something to the effect of, "Yeah, I think Messiah may have already come, and we might have missed it." And it was grievous. It was heartbreaking. Maybe we bet on the wrong horse. Can we get back? I wonder. That conversation ended, but I think about that man all the time. How can he get back to worship God? How can they have access to it? The truth is, all around the world, all people everywhere are trying to get right with God. They're trying to have some understanding that makes sense of all of it. And there's a lot of options to consider. Jesus claimed to be God in the flesh. And if that's true, if he's right about that, then you don't need the temple to contain the essence of God if he was willing to be Emmanuel and be God among us. If that's true, he would replace access to God. This message that Jesus conveyed, it was so unique that it actually threatened all the sides of power during the time of Jesus. So it threatened the Jewish power, it threatened the Roman power, it threatened the pseudo-Jewish Roman thing that was going on with Herod as that client king or whatever he was. It threatened all of them. Nobody was like, "Hey, that's the one," except the weak, the destitute, all of the ones who are being marginalized and compromised after compromise to keep these other things in power. Those people, they heard the message of Jesus and says, he's the one. History says that Jesus was placed in a tomb and that 3 days later he was resurrected as evidence that he is in fact God in the flesh, that he is in fact the Son of God sent to represent the right way to worship God, that the message and the response of resurrection together become a claim and then proof that the claim is valid. And so I want to end this entire video, which I don't know how long it's been so far. I want to end this with what is the offer that is on the table? Jesus claimed that he gives life to those who believe in him. That's all throughout the Gospel of John. That he gives life to whoever calls on his name, whoever believes in him, whoever confesses him as Lord. He gives life. Jesus claimed that access to the Father is possible, and in fact is only possible through him. For the next 35 years after that he said that originally, I'm sure that the people were like, well, we got this other option. There's a temple that gives us access to the Father. But with the temple destroyed, and having been destroyed since 70 AD, how do you get to the Father? Well, if Jesus was right about who he is and he's honest, then you get to the Father through Jesus. Jesus claimed that we don't have to pick one of these losing sides and hope that in this power struggle we don't lose. Jesus' response is they're all the losers. None of these political parties and none of these governments are the ones who are going to make all of this right. He's the Savior. He's the Messiah. He's the rightful King. Jesus claims that his kingdom is already triumphant over all of this chaos that we're experiencing. His kingdom's already right. His kingdom's already won. And so if Jesus was telling the truth, if you're listening to this, and whoever sends you this, they want you to know, if Jesus is right, you can have life right now, real life. Whatever Jesus means by eternal life, abundant life, overflowing life, he uses those phrases all throughout. That is something that is offered to anyone who bows a knee to Jesus. And it's offered in this moment. It's not an afterlife conversation. That's like the cherry on top. But life now, in this chaos, in this mud of this world that we're in, we get life now. If Jesus is telling the truth, you can have access to the Father right now through him. You don't need to wait for a new temple to be built. You don't need to wait for a new truth to be discovered. That Jesus has already made the path to the Father accessible. And you can be in peace, at peace with the God of the universe. And in fact, Scripture, says, pray to him like a father. You call him Father, that he invites you to have conversations with him. Through Jesus, access to the Father is possible. Only if Jesus was telling the truth. If Jesus was telling the truth, followers of Jesus don't need a temple building because we can know him personally. Paul in the New Testament later takes this a step further and says, don't you know that you, Christian, are the temple, that the Holy Spirit no longer resides in a physical marble building in the center of a city, that the Holy Spirit resides in you? Don't you know that you're the temple now? That's a big theological exclamation point that I'm not going to explain right now. Maybe another video. You can be a part of his kingdom if Jesus was telling the truth. If he really is a king, and he really is the ruler of a kingdom that has already won, he invites you to bow a knee to him and become a citizen of that kingdom, and then to act and live in a way that your ethics reflect the ethics of the kingdom. On earth as it is in heaven, we say a lot around here that in your family and in your workspace, you operate not by the rules of whatever kingdom and whatever forces and choosing which horse you operate that way. Why do you have the ability to do that? Because he gave you life and he's worth it. Jesus is Lord, and he's Lord of all. If you've watched to the end of this, God bless you. I hope that this history helps you understand the tension that is present in the New Testament, and it really helps you understand how there's no real person of secure power in the New Testament except Jesus. All of them are so terrified that their illusion of power is about to be torn down, and the only person who is able to hold their head up with confidence seems to be Jesus. Everybody else is a nervous little cat. And I don't know. I've become convinced that Jesus is Lord. I hope that many others do as well. God bless you. Hope to do this again. Bye.